So our next speaker is John Thomas, Deputy Director at ULAS, and he's going to be talking on taking stock of the pot, creating and recreating the Glenfield Iron Age cauldrons.
Thank you. Have I got the microphone on all right? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, good morning everyone. I'm going to be staying in the Iron Age in around the very similar kind of period to Matt was talking about, really, the 3rd and 4th centuries BC in the Middle Iron Age. And talking about a wonderful project that we were involved with over, well, we started over the winter of 2013-2014, which was a similar kind of winter to this one. It's very wet, and so I was going to introduce it by saying it's a lovely project. Well, there's different layers of lovely, isn't there? I mean, the research has been lovely, the finds were lovely, but actually extracting the information from the ground was pretty horrible and wretched and sticky. But you'll see as we go along that some of the effects of that. So it's another very much a collaborative project, and we find that when we find these incredible objects that are kind of buck the trend of the stuff that we normally find, you do need to involve more people, more expertise, and those projects are really great because you learn so much more. All of the work was funded by Wilson Bowden Developments, who are a local company, very generously funding this work and have taken us way beyond what we would normally do with helping to fund the replica, which you'll be able to see upstairs later on. So very great thanks to them. As with much of the work that we do with ULAS, and as Matt described with Enderby, we were there ahead of a development. This time, a very large area on the edge of Glenfield. This is Glenfield Village, on the, sort of more or less on the edge of the urban sprawl of Leicester, really. Very large area. Known as Optimus Point. It's important to distinguish this from Optimus Prime, of course, which is something else altogether, but is sometimes do refer to that by mistake. However, it's a large distribution centre. You can see it's very neatly located adjacent to the M1 motorway here. And actually, thinking about what we got archaeologically, it's quite an interesting connection, you'll see as we go along. So there had been some work there in the past. There had been field walking in the area that had identified the potential archaeologically. There had been a couple of excavations in the 90s in advance of this road. So we knew that there was a likelihood of more archaeology being there. And as you can see from this image, all of those lines represent the evaluation trenches that were done by Cotswold Archaeology. And then subsequently ULAS came in to do the excavation, and those trenches had identified a number of key areas where the archaeology lay. You'll see that there's an ominous blank spot in the middle there, and we have found, and this is worth bearing in mind in terms of the archaeology and the fragile nature of survival, that area in the middle had actually been disturbed during the construction of the M1. There had been a borrow pit there, and all of the soil had been taken away, and consequently there was no archaeology in that area. It's very lucky that they didn't choose this field here. So in terms of what we found, the general areas, areas 4, 5 and 2 and 3 gave us an idea that there's an awful lot going on in the landscape. It supported what was found in the field walking. This was later Iron Age and Roman activity. It was almost like it spread out from this original focus here, where we found a very large area of virtually complete Middle Iron Age settlements. It lay on slightly raised ground. It's a slightly raised kind of promontory, if you like. That may be kind of giving it more importance than it really is geographically. It's not very high, but if you get to this point here, you're reasonably well above the more sticky, clayey areas. The general area of the promontory or bluff or whatever you want to call it is slightly more sandy. So slightly more preferable soils, slightly elevated, and so this is where the activity seemed to, in Middle Iron Age, had been concentrated. we got a very large sort of spread of settlements, 4 hectares in extent. And you can see at the top, where I was pointing to, where it comes up to its kind of cliff edge area, there's a very large 50-metre diameter enclosure, probably chosen very specifically for being in that prominent spot. But then spreading down from there, a whole sprawl of Iron Age roundhouses, quite a concentration. We don't normally find this many in one area. There were other structures as well, 4-post structures for raised granaries or storage areas, lots and lots of Iron Age pits, and you'll see some enclosures here with a slightly different character, and these are slightly later to everything that you see in the middle. So this really represents the beginnings of that sort of spreading out into the landscape in the later periods. Now, we are kind of closing in on the final stages of the analysis of this site. It's a shame I haven't got some prettier plans, but you'll have to bear with me for the moment. But roughly speaking, all of these roundhouses didn't all stand at the same time, and we've been able to work out that there is some phasing to the site. There is a smattering of Late Bronze Age activity, mostly represented by finds in pits. There are some post-built roundhouses which may relate to that kind of period of occupation. But we see the first instance of Middle Iron Age occupation, which is the earlier part of the Middle Iron Age, maybe the 5th or 6th centuries BC, represented by this open plan arrangement of roundhouses, and you'll see that they kind of cluster in pairs, and where they in these nice examples that I'm trying to highlight to you, one is slightly bigger than the other, and the general consensus is that, based on evidence that we've found so far across the country, is that these kind of arrangements may relate to a domestic focus in one building and a cooking or craftworking focus in the other. So there's a kind of domestic setup there, and that's interesting to see. We don't often find this kind of evidence for this period in Leicestershire, so that's an instant kind of interesting part to this story. However, in the later part of the Middle Iron Age, the 3rd or 4th centuries, that whole system changed dramatically. And you'll see that it went to an arrangement of individual roundhouses, each with its own enclosure, which is quite interesting. It perhaps hints at a slightly different social outlook. So that's interesting as well. It's kind of getting into the sort of social scene of the Iron Age, which you don't always get. There's a general feeling also that some of these arrangements are just later developments of what was there before. So possibly this setup moved to here. You can see there's a very clear cutting over and slight shifting. But you can see they're all in this kind of general linear kind of formation, hugging that slightly higher ground, making use of that. There's also areas of metalworking, which is really interesting. We don't often find that evidence on Iron Age sites in Leicestershire either. But the other thing that we really don't find is Iron Age metal. And you'd think, with it being the Iron Age, there'd be lots of it about, but there really isn't. And until we did this site and the work we did at Borough Hill around the same time, which really kind of expanded our understanding of Iron Age metalworking and objects, there really wasn't a lot to go on. But the key defining characteristic of this site is the amount of metalwork we did find, and hopefully you can see all those red stars on there. You can see that it is spread all across the site. Significantly, we got interesting objects that we hadn't really seen before on Iron Age sites, possibly because of the dating of the sites slightly earlier than some of the ones we've done. Lovely dress pins, which were the precursors of brooches for holding clothing together. Strange objects like this horn cap. There's only about 15 of these from the country. No one really knows what they're used for. They're quite sort of unusual. They often occur, though, in unusual deposits. So there's clearly some kind of significance to them in the Iron Age. a complete one-off for our area, complete Iron Age sword, Middle Iron Age sword. So a whole range of objects, lots of socketed iron tools, and all sorts going on. But the key discovery was a whole series of Iron Age cauldrons, great big metal objects that were used in feasting. They hold an awful lot of food or liquid, up to 50 litres of material. And they were all concentrated, they were largely concentrated on this enclosure, and that's the first preview really of what horrible conditions it was. You can see they're arranged around the enclosure. There's a series of 5 of them here. And this is interesting as well because we found it was the enclosures in that second phase of activity that really held a lot of the artefactual material. And the ditches had been the setting for deposits, either intentional or otherwise. But because we'd got so many of these enclosures across the site, we could look at patterning. And the very strong indication was that the southeastern area of all of these enclosures was where most of the material was going in. And it's very nicely illustrated here with these 5 cauldrons. And you can see where the sort of silhouettes of the cauldrons that I've put on here to indicate where they're from. You can also see that some of them were put in the ground upright and some of them were put in upside down. And they are put in this ditch very intentionally, we think. They sat on the bottom of the ditch as it was open, and then it would appear that it was rapidly backfilled after they'd gone in there. So it seems like this is some sort of closure deposit for whatever activity is going on here. We think there was probably a roundhouse in the middle, but unfortunately the evidence doesn't really help that much. There's 2 very nice entrance post holes here. You can see sitting very neatly within the entrance of the enclosure, but they're within here, there's something different going on. And then, just to give us a hint of the dating, we've got this lovely involuted brooch, which has been recently sort of redated due to the work of Sophie Adams that Matt referred to before, helping with the shield, to the 3rd century BC. So that gives us a starting point as to where we might be looking with these objects and when this activity was taking place. Okay, some more mucky pictures. So you can see, with this one here, you can see we've started to excavate the ditch, and it's only just a little bit wider than the cauldrons. And there's the top of the cauldron. This is one that's sat in the ground in an upright position. And this is how we did find them through metal detecting generally, but the state of the metal was pretty poor, so it was quite difficult to find them. But we did more or less 100% excavation of this ditch to get everything we could. And you can see as we went down, we had to widen the excavation out to get to them. These objects are incredibly fragile. They've been sat in the ground for over 2,000 years. They weren't very strong in the first place. They're very thin metal, and the corrosion has really sort of taken its toll on them. So we couldn't do anything with them in terms of micro excavation in the ground. They had to come out for laboratory excavation. So we had to create space to get in and around them, to wrap them up in plaster of Paris bandages, and then eventually extract them from the site. And of course, it was a horrible site, really sticky. We couldn't get a 4x4 over to the enclosure because it was sat at the very end, the very far end of the site. So we had to go through this kind of strange process of getting them off site. We were very tense and hoping not to drop them. And you can see this was one of the very last ones that we excavated, and because we found so many, we'd ran out of plaster of Paris tape, so bandages, so we had to use hazard tape. And there it is with the others. And so we got all of these cauldrons out of the ground. They were in the lab. What do we do with them now? And this is really when, they sat there for about a year waiting for us to sort of find a project partner. Eventually we found Museum of London Archaeology and the conservators there. They had recently been working on the Anglo-Saxon burial known as the Prittlewell prints, and they had a cauldron in there. So they had form with this kind of object, and they seemed a good match. So before any excavation could take place, it was a key question was what was in the soil blocks. We had a good idea of what might be in them. We'd kind of done some delicate little excavations to see if the bowls of these cauldrons are actually there. Quite often, when cauldrons are found on their own, you find like just the rim or just a handle, and it's not always given that the whole thing is there. So we wanted to make sure that everything was there, but also to give a early warning to the conservators so they could work out what they had to deal with. And in a similar way to what Matt just described, what do you do with bandaged up things? You take them to hospital. And so Mola had been working with this hospital in Essex, the Paul Strickland Scanner Centre. Of course, these objects are a bit too large for sort of conventional X-rays. And we did have someone who worked at East Midlands Airport in the evenings, and he took one of these over to put it through the baggage X-ray thing, and it gave us some kind of indication, but not as detailed as you will get from a CT scan. And so we got this rather wonderful early warning. And as it goes around, you'll see that you can see some of the elements of the cauldron. You can see the handles. There's a 50p scale, if anyone's wondering. And all of these little dots are the remains of copper alloy rivets, which would have held everything together. You see that the bowl you can't see at all because it's so thin and corroded. But having that kind of arrangement of the rivets actually gives you a much clearer idea of what's in there. So that was all really good early warnings for the conservators. And then it became the job of Liz Barham and her colleagues at Mola in the conservation lab to actually try and extract information from these, by now, rock-solid chunks of Leicestershire clay. Little did they know what they were in for. And I think it took on average between 3 and 4 months of solid work to get the information out of these soil blocks. But as they worked, you'll see that information started to appear. So here it is, they're working on this one here. You can see the iron rim and the ring handle of this one here. This is quite early in the stage, and then as they get further in, this is one that was buried upside down. So what they came down onto was the outer surface to start with, and you can see the copper alloy, which would have made the bowl. And you'll see also how highly fragmented it is. It's just like the world's worst jigsaw. But, you know, containing incredible information. And as they went through, they maintained this rather spectacular kind of drawing to keep a track of all of the different elements of the cauldron in case anything shifted and they weren't able to sort of put it back in its right place. I find these quite mind-boggling in themselves. But an incredible record, because the process of excavation of these cauldrons means that we are completely destroying them. There isn't anything really left with which to display, which makes the replica even more important, of course. And then once they got through, they flipped the whole thing over and started looking at the interior. And again, you'll see the same kind of approach. The whole thing has been pancaked with it being in the heavy soil for so long. So it's basically like a frisbee. But you can see lots of different aspects, lots of different patches, different materials. This is an iron patch here. And looking at, by taking that time to go through and carefully inspect everything as they were excavating it, they were able to get into the detail of how these things were made on a really highly detailed scale. So they were able to find out about how the iron and the copper alloy were joined together with all of these rivets, lots of evidence of repair patches and how they were fitted, all these little miniature washers and rivets. And then by looking at the ironwork in a little bit more detail, I said it's all horribly corroded. Just doing some x-rays of specific parts, we were able to find out the composition of the ring handles and the attachments. And you can see that this one here has a sort of tri-ribbed kind of attachment. a little bit like what Matt was talking about with the shield attachments. And so, putting all of the evidence together at this stage that we had, we were able to work out that the cauldrons that we had were a sort of Middle Iron Age variety, which is known as a globular composite cauldron. The globular, you can see from the shape, and the composite with it being a composition of different materials and different parts. This is where we are, and you can see the general distribution of these Type 2 cauldrons is further south and east to our region, apart from this outlier in Ireland here. There aren't that many of them known at all, but one site from Wiltshire that had been excavated in a few years before ours, down in Wiltshire at Chiseldon here, had found a single pit that contained 17 of these cauldrons. Like, it's a proper hoard of them. And incredibly fortuitous timing-wise, we were just starting our excavation of these at the same time as the Chiseldon team, led by Jodie Joy, who was working at the British Museum at that point, was coming to the end of their analysis. So we were able to dovetail really nicely with them, and that's been incredibly important in terms of helping with the research and maintaining the same team that worked on both sites. So all of the scientists that we've used and advice from the conservators that were working on this site have all really helped with the continuity of this research, which has gone from one site to another and really expanded on our understanding of these objects. This is a picture of the excavated cauldrons in the pit. Now, this was a metal detector find, and there was some rustled up money very quickly to sort of excavate this one pit. It's a very different site, of course, to what we've got here. So this is a really interesting insight into hoarding in the Middle Iron Age, but that's all they know about this site. What we have in Glenfield is a much more detailed and interesting context in terms of who was using them, what was used, how they were being used, and how they were being deposited, and what that meant to for the community that used them, and interpretations about what was going on at the site in Glenfield. And this is from the Chiseldon work. This is a sort of blow-up, really, of the types of elements that you might expect. So the iron elements are at the top. You get an iron band, an iron rim sitting on the top, and then the ring handles, sometimes with a decorated plate below the handles. And then the main bowl is a band of iron, a band of copper alloy, and then a smaller bowl at the bottom. The bottom bit is interesting because they're quite fragile objects. They would have been fragile when they were in use. And, of course, if they're suspended over a fire, that bottom bit is where the most wear and tear would have happened. So the bowl C, as it's called in these, the Chiseldon evidence suggested that this was probably a repair. It suggested that these things were quite long-lived. They'd been used for a very long time, to the point where they'd kind of worn out at the bottom. And these were repair things. So we were interested to find out if that was the same case for the Glenfield ones. Of course, being so close in time with that project, we were able to sort of compare and contrast the evidence, which has really helped push the understanding on. Here's a good example of that. So even though they are generally the same sort of size and shape, some of them are bigger than others, they've generally got the same sort of form, but if you get into the detail of them, they do have their own little characteristics. So at Chiseldon, they found that the rim band type was all sorts of angles. Some of them were dog-legged, some of them were flared out, some of them went straight down. And then also with the rims as well, there are lots of different types of rims, and I don't really know what this means, whether or not it means there's different ways of, different people doing different methods, and they're all coming together in one place. Whether or not it's a slight chronological development, we need to think about that a bit more. But in terms of the Glenfield ones, you can see that by and large we had more of the straight convex type bands, but a similar kind of range of the rims as well. So we've got solid and hollow type rims. Now, to get that information from the very corroded iron, we needed to look, or Liz, the conservator, needed to carefully chop through to get sections to see the profile, because it was hiding in there, but you can see from this picture the corrosion you couldn't really see without chopping through. And so this gave us not only a really great insight into the format of the rims and how they might have worked with the cauldrons, but incredibly, what we found, and completely unexpected, we found charred wood remains inside. And these are the remains of willow withies, which were used as formers on the cauldron to help shape the rim. So the withies were put in place, they're nice and flexible, and then the iron rim was hammered over them, and it's encapsulated them, and they've charred in the process of the rim being heated up. Well, you think that the rims were probably heated up to the point where they were flexible enough that they could be then popped onto the top of the cauldron and shrunk on, so that they would maintain that kind of rigidity and be flush with the vessel. But in doing that, it's preserved this amazing information. And this is the first time that this evidence has been found on any cauldron, as far as I'm aware. And because it's so nicely preserved, we were able to get some radiocarbon dates, and that gives us a nice Middle Iron Age date between the 4th and the 3rd century BC. And I think, again, I'm quite sure that these are the first direct radiocarbon dates that anyone has been able to get for the construction of this type of cauldron. So really important stuff. And again, overlapping specialists. Caroline Cartwright, who worked with Matt on the shield at the British Museum, has been instrumental in this. There are more really interesting bits of evidence from the conservation and the examination of the metalwork in terms of the construction of these cauldrons. How were they made? Little hints of this line here, showing that there's a mark outline as to where these rivets should go. You can see they're quite evenly spaced. It's all very neat and tidy, but there's a guide coming along. Similarly here, you've got some mark outlines, but also some little snips where things might have gone wrong. So it's clear it wasn't always an easy process making these things and working with this material. But also here, hammer indentations all across the copper alloy. And this is where the creators of the cauldrons have been hammering out that copper alloy sheet, trying to get the shape of the bowl coming up. As I mentioned before, we also found lots of really good evidence for wear, tear and repair. So these cauldrons are obviously something that's really, really important to the communities that were using them. They kept them going. They weren't just sort of made to go straight in the ground or for a one-off use. They'd been used and used and used. They'd been worn out, but they'd been kept going. And, you know, that would have generated stories about these cauldrons and made them even more important to the people that used them. The Chiseldon cauldrons had a similar kind of use history, but they got lots of what they called fancy patching, so lots of interesting shapes. We got sort of squares and ovals and things like that in terms of the patches. They had more geometric shapes, interesting kind of fishtail shapes, that kind of thing, which perhaps a little bit more decorative. The only thing that we found here, which I really, really love, is this marking here on this, you know, fairly rectangular patch. I have no idea what this might be, whether or not it's a mender's signature, whether or not it had some kind of symbolic kind of meaning to the person that made it. I don't know, but it's a really nice little bit of extra evidence into something that we probably will never understand, but it shows that people were caring enough about what they were doing to add these embellishments to the patches. What were they cooking in them? I mentioned they were probably used for feasting. They can hold a lot of food or drink. Well, fantastically, even though, you know, the soil was really hard around the metal, we did get some traces of food crusts, largely around the rim, on the iron sections, where I guess if people are serving from the cauldron, bits would have slopped out and got caught in the fire and survived in that way. And you can see it on this image here, these kind of dark sooty areas. We didn't get as many of these kind of samples as they did from Chiseldon, but critically we did get some. And the lipid analysis on these has identified meat fat, probably cows, probably cattle, so beef stew. I think we did find some evidence of, or Rebecca found some evidence of vegetable matter in there as well. But again, thinking in terms of pushing the analysis forward from Chiseldon and looking at different ways in which we can interpret this evidence, they had suggested that there was one cauldron that had pottage, or not pottage, yeah, you know, sort of organic, sort of oaty kind of substance in there. Perhaps a vegetarian option, I don't know. But Rebecca has looked at this in a bit more detail, and she thinks because of the rootlets coming into the soil from more modern agricultural activity above the site, that might be leaving that signature there. So there's more research to do on that, but it's an interesting kind of expansion of understanding. But no, essentially, lots of evidence of beef stew hanging on there. And then, really interestingly and incredibly rare, the scanning did show that one of the cauldrons had some decoration on. You can just see bits of it here hanging on the band, and it's a bit more clear in this rendered version. But this is sort of evidence of this Valdaugasheim or vegetal style decoration, sort of Celtic art, which I think is thought to be, or was thought to be, something a little bit earlier in date in terms of what we've got here. But there's another one from Chiseldon which has this kind of decoration on, and it's helping to sort of expand our understanding of how more widespread this art form was in use for. There's only a handful of objects from Iron Age Britain which has this kind of decoration on, so it's really important in terms of our understanding of that. And there it is. There's the iron fragment there. It would have been applied to the rim, to the band just below the handle, and there's a drawing of it there. So we've got these squashed frisbees of horrible corroded metal. We've got evidence of how they were made. So what do they look like in reality? Well, we worked with another project partner, Hector Cole. Some of you may know his work. He was on Time Team a few times. He's an incredibly skilled blacksmith. He mostly does arrows and weapons. He's got a nice range of Lord of the Rings arrowheads, if anyone wants some of them. You can go on his website and buy them. But he had done a replica of one of the Chiseldon cauldrons. So I thought, if we can get some money from the developers to do this, he's the person to go to. And they were very gracious in doing so. And here he is at work. So he's making the bowl at this point here. He basically started out with a flat copper alloy sheet, just over 1 millimetre thick, and he's using this hollowed out tree trunk here to get the kind of bowl shape, and he's hammering and hammering away, as you can see here, just to lift the whole thing into this kind of bowl shape. The trouble is, the more he does that, the thinner it gets, and the further away from the starting point, as in the base of the cauldron he gets, the more risk there is of it tearing and being damaged beyond repair. And so this leads us back to this idea of this lower bowl, and what we're now thinking, and it's partly because of the work that Hector's done, is that was, by the time that the bowl was raised to its full height, then that lower part was so thin it was probably going to be not very useful for very long, and so that we think there was a deliberate attempt to kind of consolidate that by snipping that bit out and making a new lower part of the bowl, which is the same thickness as the rest of it, so it keeps it all consistent. So that's a really interesting sort of observation and understanding from the replica making. And here he is making some of the iron objects, and he started out with billets of iron to make the handles and the rim. A long time to make all of this. He thinks around, well, over 100 hours of solid work just to make one cauldron. And that gives you an idea of how precious and expensive they may well have been to people in the Iron Age, probably because, and that gives you an indication of perhaps why they're quite rare. He also made a former in lead for the handle plate, which repoussé, relief work, which he then sort of hammered over with the iron plates to get that shape. And there's a detail of that. So lots of different techniques that he really, I say he enjoyed. He says he's never going to do another cauldron again. But he really enjoyed investigating the processes. And of course, he's coming at it from a modern perspective, but because he's had a lifetime of working with historic artifacts, he can sort of get some way back into the mindset of people that were working these objects in the past. So just to wrap up, this is a fantastic addition to our understanding of the Iron Age in Leicestershire, but it's going to have wider repercussions even into Europe. These two sites, Chiseldon and Glenfield, are the only two sites in the whole of Iron Age Europe that have multiple cauldrons associated with them, and we have so much more of an understanding now by putting both sites together, which will be able to tell everybody about how they were made, how they were used, how they were looked after, and how they were buried when they went out of use. So yeah, the evidence strongly suggests that this was not just a settlement, it was probably quite a key feature in the Iron Age landscape of the area. It was probably something that was a host site for lots of people coming together from the surrounding countryside, from the farmsteads around, to engage in big feasts, which would have been catered for by these fantastic cauldrons full of meat stew, or if you're lucky, gruel, vegetarian gruel. And so that gives us a really great insight into social relations in the Iron Age. People would have needed to come together to forge alliances, find marriage partners, maybe even if someone there really needed a new roundhouse, and they thought, I can't. If a bit like me, I'm not very good at hands-on things. I can't do DIY today. But if I'm quite good at cooking. So if I make a nice meat stew, I can get all of my friends to come in and help build a roundhouse. And there's that transaction there going on, which helps create society, keep society going on. So I think really importantly as well, the collaborative work, having that wider team, that bigger understanding has really helped. It's helped everybody learn. It's helped a much richer outcome for the project. And of course, finally, with the replica, we have something with which people can see and enjoy and understand what these objects are for. Eventually, quite soon, we'll hopefully publish all the results, and we'll feature an exhibition at the new Jewellery Wall Museum when it opens next year. Fingers crossed. And here is the replica. The picture doesn't do it justice, so please come and have a look at it upstairs, and thank you very much for listening.